I'm Jeffrey Sachs from Beit Agnon in Yerushalayim, and I am delighted as always to be joined by my teacher and friend, Professor Ruth Wisse. Tonight we'll be talking about A.M. Klein's novel, The Second Scroll. Klein was a Canadian journalist and poet who has been called the first contributor of authentic Jewish poetry to the English language. The Second Scroll, which was published in 1951, was actually his only novel, and it depicts a kind of semi-autobiographical narrator who travels to the newly founded state of Israel. The novel itself is set in 1949 to actually parallel an actual visit that Klein made as a journalist to visit the new Jewish state from his native Montreal, from his native Canada, which perhaps not by coincidence is the native home of Ruth Wisse. While he's there, he discovers a new revelation of God's purpose in the world. That's a quote from the novel, and finds a revived Jewish people in the, quote, leap from existence back to essence. Well, that's a lot to talk about. And Ruth, you have for the past number of years, well, really throughout your whole long career, you have been undertaking this project of resurfacing the Jewish classics, of course, in Yiddish and in Hebrew and in English and perhaps other languages as well, drawing them to our attention, uh, milking them, juicing them for their essence. And as so often happens through your analysis, we discover how these forgotten classics, and frankly, probably very few of us had been familiar with Klein or with the Second Scroll. I had been until you brought it to my attention a year or so ago. Um, and we discover how very, very relevant they are. Before we get into our conversation, I'd just like to invite everyone to take note of Agnon House's upcoming English language tour of Poland, which will be leaving on July 15th. We travel in the footsteps of Agnon, with Agnon in hand, reading Agnon's stories of Polish Jewry, uh, and we always have a very engaging, intelligent group of people. Some of you online actually have traveled with us in the past, and I think some of you are actually coming with us this summer. We have one spot left for either an individual or for a couple. So if you'd like to get that, you can visit us at that link that you see on the screen or in the chat box. In the chat box as well is a link for you to sign up. Some of you have joined us tonight because you heard about it on Facebook or elsewhere, or contacted directly, but you really should be receiving the occasional email update newsletters from Beit Agnon. Please do sign up to receive those. And as well, in the chat box is a link to some of the sample chapters from the Second Scroll, which we'll be looking at tonight. They'll be displayed on the screen, but if you'd like to download them to read for later, please do so. They're also, of course, available on our website. So A.M. Klein, who was born in 1909 and dies in 1972, is a poet. He's a journalist. He's the author of this one novel. And Ruth, you actually met Klein on one, I think, special occasion, as you related in your memoirs, as I've heard you tell the story a number of times. So first of all, Ruth, welcome. I've neglected to mention your introduction, which is written out
Please.
in full, but of course it goes without saying that you are the Martin Peretz Professor of Yiddish Literature and Comparative Literature Emerita at Harvard University. I mentioned Harvard University because I think we're going to maybe come back to some things that are going on American college campuses later
Hope
later
not.
in our conversation. And you are, of course, most significantly for the past number of years, the distinguished senior fellow at the Tikva Fund, where many of us interact with your writing and teaching and speaking, and a very trenchant podcast that was released from Tikva last week that I commend to everyone's attention. You're the author of countless essays and books and recipient of many prizes, and I'll spare you all of that. But tell again. So welcome, Ruth. We're so happy to have you here. for our annual conversation. Tell us about this novel. Tell us about Klein, about your own encounter with him, and how that came about, and why you've decided to bring this back to our attention now.
Well, I have never stopped being involved with this novel. And I think that you should know, even though I'm not a native Montrealer, I did indeed spend most of
Yeah.
my life there. And Klein is not at all unknown. So maybe that's the first thing that should be said, that Montreal is quite unusual in the English speaking world. It was really much more like Prague and like Vilna, multicultural and multilingual and multi-ethnic cities, where it was much easier for Jews to remain apart and distinctive, because in Montreal, the French Catholic, French Canadian community is quite separate from the English Protestant ethnic
Mhm.
community. And in that kind of atmosphere, you see Jews and now more recently Italians and other groups tend to stay also pretty much apart to the extent that they want to. This is not to say that it's at all necessarily ghettoized, not at all. But you find yourself much more culturally inhabiting your own part of the city. So that was Klein's experience growing up, and he took it very much for granted, as we all do in that context. So he was multilingual himself. His parents made sure that he knew Hebrew, of course. Yiddish was the language of the home. He's fluent in it. English is the language of the street to some extent, but also French. He became a lawyer, so he functioned in French and in English. And when he was at McGill University, he already began to be a published poet, part of a poetic group, a young English poetic group that set themselves, if you want to hear this, against Victorian England. That was their kind of, they were modern poets. And so he was part of that group. However, at the same time, he became the editor of the Canadian Jewish Chronicle, which was a Canadian literary and news publication. And in terms of this novel, Jeffrey, the most interesting thing about it is something curious in, I think, Jewish history in general. You see, in the 1930s, um, of course, Montrealers, who are a more, they were a younger immigrant group than those in America, were very much aware of what was happening in Europe.
Mhm.
Many had relatives there, and they were very much involved in what was happening, both in Europe and, of course, in the Yishuv in Palestine. And so they had founded the Canadian Jewish Congress, which was supposed to be the umbrella organization for Canadian Jewry. But the Canadian Jewish Congress, um, how strong was it? How strong could it actually be? How visible could it be? That would always be the question for Jewish organizations. So it had the brilliant idea of trying to get Samuel Bronfman, the wealthiest Jew in Canada, the owner of Seagram's,
Mhm.
the great
Sure,
liquor,
of course.
to get him to be the president of the Canadian Jewish Congress. Now, all of this is not irrelevant, because he did take on the leadership of the Canadian Jewish Congress, much to his credit and its credit. And he realized that he was not a spokesman. So, although he was a figurehead, how was he going to get the words? And so, who was the best wordsman in Canada at the time? A.M.
Klein.
Klein, right. So that became a kind of amazing union of a person of great wealth and a person of great talent. And it's in that role that when the war was over, that the Canadian Jewish Congress in 1949 wanted to have someone rouse the Canadian people to get money for Israel, to help resettle the refugees. I mean, the work of the Canadian Jewish Congress continued during the war, but it became even more important after the war.
After the
So
war.
they sent him on a fact-finding mission to Israel, and
Mhm.
on the way also to Casablanca to see what was
Right.
happening with the exit of because there was a huge, of course,
right, of the Mizrahi Jews, of
Mizrahi
the North
Jews,
African Jews, of the
right, and also to the displaced persons camp in Europe. So this is the trip that
right.
A.M. Klein
Right, and
actually.
this is the biographical kernel, the autobiographical kernel
Exactly,
that
exactly, and
we travel with him through these different stations in the novel.
exactly. And so what you could say is, and he did write, by the way, he didn't wait to write the novel. He kept copious notes. He
Hmm.
kept writing articles about
And he
this
was reporting. He was
as it was
reporting. Yeah.
reporting. And very helpfully, he gave speeches afterwards, which was
Right.
based on this experience. So yes, in a way, you see, this is what is this book? We call it a novel, and of course, it is structured more or less as a novel, but it is very unique. One, it is, as you say, autobiographical fiction. It is based on much of his life, and he brings himself as the narrator into the book. Um, Secondly, it is a historical novel because I think that what we will talk about is the way in which he makes this about Jewish history at that moment. It's about the evolution of the Jews in that moment. And you know what I was thinking today, that one of the things that it has to have a new kind of thing. This is a national saga. I think that what he tried to do here was something quite interesting. He calls it the second scroll because it is divided into 5 books: Exodus,
Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. Yeah.
Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. He doesn't hide the fact. In fact, in every way possible, he makes us aware of the
Right.
degree to which he is writing this in the shadow of, or under the, not, it's kind of interlinearly with the Chumash, and and he is writing it as a national saga,
Right.
and it's very moving to talk about it today because this is the eve of Yom HaShoah. And of course, the Shoah plays a part in this
Yeah.
novel, as you made sure to, that made a great influence on you when you were reading it, if I understand.
Yeah. Correct.
But if you read this book, and I do hope the purpose of all of this, by the way, is only to get people to read the book,
Right.
not necessarily to watch or to listen to this. Um, if you read it, what you begin to see is that it is, yes, the Shoah is part of it. Everything is part of it. All of history is part of it. But it is about the miracle of the creation of the state of Israel in that same decade
Mm.
as the Shoah. And Klein, because he is a poet, he has no inhibitions about the degree to which he can really poeticize this moment and elevate this moment in any way that he possibly can. Obviously, from a narrative, within a narrative context, but it is a hallelujah.
Yeah. The praise, the prose is so it is so poetic,
Yes,
is
well, we
indeed so
have to
poetic,
talk
and
about that.
the division of the five. Well, we'll taste a bit of the prose in a few minutes, but the division of the book into these 5 chapters, named each after the five
So
books
the
of Moses, the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, but attaching them thematically. Each chapter takes place at a different station on his journey. Only in the final chapter or book do we arrive in Israel, having passed through Canada and Casablanca and Italy and where else until we get to Jerusalem, Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and wherever else he travels. And then
well,
end
at
of
the
the
end. Mm-hmm.
yeah, at the end of the book,
Mm-hmm.
he has what he calls glosses, some of which, at least there are a number of different editions of the book.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are laid out with, kind of like an old style font, as if to like remind you of rabbinic literature. And these are the kind of Talmudic exegeses on the 5 books of Moses. And as you're reading the novel, there are side notes that are directing you off to these exegeses. And some of the exegeses are even printed, again, in my edition, uh, the, way a Talmud pages with a central text and then text around the text, the commentary and the super commentary reminding us of a page of Talmud with Rashi and Tosfot, etc. This is mean, this was 1951, you know,
He's writing it from, yes, from
yeah,
1950.
this is one imagines who his who his authors were and who his readers were and what he was doing and what was unique, what was going on in at that period in the very early 1950s in Jewish literature. In well, it's interesting. I'm of course I erred, of course. I know, of course, that you are a native of Chernivtsi in what
That's
today is
okay.
what today
That's
is
all
Ukraine. But it's I can be forgiven for thinking of
right.
you as a Montrealer because
Sorry
it's
for
so
making
central.
that.
It's so central to you. Wear your identity as a Montrealer on your sleeve so proudly that I should be forgiven for calling you a native of Montreal. But there's a brilliant line that I flagged, and I thought of you, of course. There's a passage where I'll call him Klein, meaning the narrator, the projection of the author into the book. He's talking to somebody. This is in the Leviticus chapter, and this person in Italy calls in an Americano, and he
Mhm.
says, "I'm not an American. I'm a Canadian."
Right.
And the fellow says, "Is there a difference? Isn't Canada the 49th state?" This is, of course, before Hawaii and Alaska. He says, "On the contrary, the states are our 11th province."
Yes. Yes.
So his laughter, the gall of the Canuck, the utter absurdity rang through the corridor. But in fact, at least we Americans, we Americans think that America is New York,
Yeah.
and we think that New York is, one neighborhood in Manhattan.
Well,
But that's of course not true. So explain to us what is happening in Canadian Jewish letters that he becomes a pioneer of at the time. Who is his imagined audience as he's writing
well,
this
you
rather unusual
see,
book?
you would have to look. There's so much to go through here. We're just going to have to be very selective. But in fact, you see, you cannot parochialize this. From the Canadian point of view, A.M. Klein is extraordinarily important. And what you've pointed out is that there have been multiple editions of this book. And one of them has, the one that I have here is really subsidized heavily by the Canadian government. And
Mm-hmm.
it has more than 70, it has many more pages of text, of footnotes, than it
Right.
has text. And there have been biographies of Klein. Everything of his has been published, although there's only one published novel. People have wanted to dig up from the archives every letter of his, every poem of his. There have been commentaries on him. So, and he won the Governor General's medal for
Mm-hmm.
poetry in the same year that he took that trip
Right. Right.
to. Um, so Klein is not a small figure, and but he was very different from the American
Right.
Jewish writers in the sense that he was very much embedded in Jewish life. And to him, it was not a side aspect of his thing. You see, this was a time when even Bellow at that point and was saying that he and Bernard Malamud and Philip Roth were like a clothing firm that he knew. Mark, I don't remember, Schaefer and Marx, the three tailors, you see, they didn't want to be known as American Jewish
Sure.
writers.
Sure.
This was not because they felt that it's not
Right.
that they didn't think of themselves as Jews or write about it all the time,
Right.
but this was not the central point
Right.
of their
Right. Right.
lives.
Well, to his dying day, Roth denied that he was in any way a Jewish writer.
Well, underplayed it for sure.
Mhm.
Klein, it's not just a question of flexing that, but you understand that one of the books that Klein wrote is The Rocking Chair, which is a book of poetry, the first book of poetry by an English poet that makes much of French Canadians, because he was the one who felt an affinity for French Canada. So the book is really like a love song to the French Canadian community, with which he thinks that the Jews have a very, very close kind of
Mhm.
familiarity in many ways. So he is quite unique in many ways. But because he is a poet, this book is amazing. The writer who made the greatest influence, who had the greatest influence on him by far, was James Joyce.
Oh, Joyce. Yeah.
Anyone reading this, knowing anything about literature, is going to think immediately, aha, this is
Ulysses.
Ulysses. That Ulysses is the great work of that takes the Odyssey and then writes about Dublin in the shadow of, well, there is that thing to think about. The way in which Klein uses the contemporary story against the background of the great text, that is similar to Joyce. But if you read the two works, then you also see the tremendous lack of similarity, because Joyce was really interested in the Dubliners that he was writing about. And the whole idea was to really talk about Dublin in a different way. For Klein, of course, the thing is to talk about Jewish history at that moment, as he's doing it. But it's not simply that. It's not that he wants to that he wants to describe what you're asking about. What is Canada like at this particular time? He's not interested in that kind of nitty gritty. But what he is interested is in telling us, you think that the Chumash is the greatest text. And it is, of course. That's why I write in its shadow. That's why there's so many allusions here to all that happens in the Chumash. But what I'm writing about is an Exodus story. What I'm writing about is a modern scroll that deserves to be written about, conceived of, in the same order of magnitude. Now, how am I going to do that? And so it is so interesting that he really has to invent a language for that. Now, Klein at that point, by the way, Jeffrey, had already translated a great deal of Hebrew poetry into English. And when we started teaching Jewish literature and translation, Klein was a godsend, because there were a lot of Yiddish poets who were accessible to us through his translations. He translated Bialik's Be'ira Harega into English, in a wonderful translation that is still quite used.
Yeah, I taught it here in Beit Agnon Zoom a few months ago.
Well, so you know how strong it is.
Yeah.
But for these things, he had to invent a language. And this is written in a way, it's an invented form. So it's quite novel, and it is also quite challenging. I have to say that the more you know the Pentateuch, the better you know the Chumash, the funnier you will find this book, the more intriguing you will find this book. The more you know about Jewish history and life, the more literate you are as a Jew, the more you will appreciate what Klein is doing. I hope the opposite is not true, that in fact, the less literate you are, the more you scratch your head and you say, wait a minute, what kind of language is this? What am I doing here?
I think we should now move on to, perhaps the most important character in the book, who is omnipresent in his absence, because much of the book is a search for Klein's uncle, Melech Davidson, or Davidson. And of course, it's a very thinly veiled reference to Melech, David's son, Ben David, the Melech HaMashiach, this kind of messianic figure. When Klein, or the character of Klein's parents, leave Europe to come to Canada, his mother leaves behind this brother Melech, who's a great Talmud scholar, but after the Russian Revolution goes the way of the Bolsheviks and then becomes disillusioned with that, suffers from pogroms, ends up in the Shoah, and then in a DP camp, and then in Italy on his way to Eretz Yisrael. And Davidson is kind of hunting for him. So why don't you explain what is the role of this character, the uncle, in the novel, and his kind of tragic end?
Right. Well, you're absolutely right. But that's a little bit anticipating. Let's back up and say that there is a plot. What is happening in this book? There is, first of all, the main character is the narrator. And he tells you of how he grew up in Montreal, and then how he undertook this journey that he's undertaking. What is this journey that he's undertaking? The journey has two parts. One, he is a poet, and he is being sent by a publisher to, can you please get an anthology of new Hebrew poetry in the land of Israel? Can you get us an anthology that is going to give us an idea of the new Hebrew poetry in the land of Israel? That's what he's going to do professionally. So that's part of the plot, that he is setting out and he's being sent on this mission to collect a book. However, as you say, there comes a letter from this uncle who has a very strange role in their household, because he was brought up to think of this uncle as the great genius. And his mother was always hoping that he would be a genius like her brother, like this great uncle. But this
By
great
genius, we mean an Ilui, a Talmudic
a
genius.
Talmudic genius. She hoped that for him. But then they find out that this uncle, in fact, during a pogrom, or as a result of the pogrom, converted to communism. And then the years go by, and the father is so angry with him that the name is not spoken in the household at all. So, in other words, Melech Davidson, at the very beginning of the book, has been exiled. He's been exiled from the home of this family. He was the Eloi, but the father would not allow his name to be mentioned anymore. And it never was again. The son is very proud of his uncle, who's a communist, because the son is attracted by communism too once he goes to university. But then everything changes. And so the novel continues. And after many years, a letter reaches them, or the news reaches them that, of course, this uncle, has gone through the Shoah. And he gets this letter on the eve of going on this journey to voyage. So once
his Odyssey.
Yes, exactly. So once he's taking that trip, that exodus, he decides that he's going to find his uncle as well. And as you say, that uncle is Melech Davidson. So he's a historical figure, an embodiment of Jewish history, if you will. And as we see, he's very important, the stages that he goes through. But he is also this thing that you're chasing, this ideal that you're chasing, never to be, can you ever find him? Right. So when you get to the land of Israel, that's one of the questions of the book that really hangs there. What happens? Is he going to find Melech Davidson? Is he going to find the Messiah? And when he finds his uncle, what is his uncle going to be like? Because he's never even seen a picture of him, you see, this elusive uncle. So there is a plot here.
Yeah. In other words, but what is Klein saying about this reborn Jewish reality in the newly founded state by setting it as this kind of search? Well, it's a search for the Messiah. It's a search for some kind of messianic hope or figure or element embodied in the person of this mysterious uncle. And what does it mean that it's the kind of thing that you search and you find, and it's elusive at every step of the game? And when he finally finds him, it's, well, spoiler alert, folks, the uncle has been killed in the events surrounding the struggles surrounding the establishment of the state. And the nephew arrives at the moment past the last moment, only in time as the only living relative to recite the Kaddish at Melech Davidson's funeral. What is Klein saying about the relationship of all of these things?
It reminds me, yes. Well, I think that the point is, the saying, I'm not sure that that's really the kind of question that I would ask, certainly. Okay. I think basically what we're being invited to do is to experience this book step by step. And the steps of Melech Davidson are really the key to everything. Mm-hmm. You see, the messianic figure here that can never be found in this book is also a historical figure of the Jew who never stops. And so the fact that in the first chapter, Melech Davidson becomes a communist, that is not incidental. What Klein was doing here is he was at the same time writing a history of the Jews in his time, an intellectual history mostly, but a very important one. So, of course, that was the temptation. The great messianic temptation was communism. So if you were searching for the Messiah and you were a Jew in the modern time, you embraced communism. And so Melech Davidson, his first step is he becomes a communist. And guess what? as a Jew, I mean, this is a very funny part too, for the way in which Klein describes the way he's able to use his Talmudic intelligence to become one of the great, thinkers of communist theory, one of the great theorists of communism. He becomes known as Comrade Cruel,
Cool. Yeah.
Krul. But of course, poetically, cruel is cruel. It's a homonym. And so this man, who is both the communist genius, is also cruel, right? I mean, very always playing here with words. Now, that part of it is not at all incidental. I mean, we are to take that very seriously. And how does he stop being a communist? Not that easily. I mean, it is through the Shoah. And it's before the Shoah. It is in 1939 when the Hitler-Stalin Pact is signed, and when Stalin, the great communist leader, becomes a partner of Hitler in the war and in the eradication of Poland and of the Jewish people begins. Well, of course, that is the end of his communism. And he is able to survive in part because he then assumes again the identity, including physically the identity of an Orthodox Jew. So he's not recognized as a former communist. He's not recognized as a communist by the Nazis or by his fellow Jews. In any case, it's in that second guise as a Jew that he has to go through the Shoah. So that is the next chapter. And how does he find out about that? Well, the boy receives a letter from Melech Davidson that was sent to his parents, who are no longer alive, but he receives this letter, as we said, on the eve of going to the land of Israel. And so then he decides that he's going to try to find him in the displaced persons camps of Europe, where he is now after the war. So that's next step. Here's a point that I would not like to neglect. What happens then in this quest? Now, here's a step that we have kind of overlooked. In the chapter of Leviticus, what does he do with the chapter where the people of Israel sort of stand before Mount Sinai? What is he going to do with that in the life of this book and in the journey of Melech Davidson and his journey to Israel? Well, this is the most daring part of the book in some ways. He is in Rome. And in Rome, Melech Davidson, of course, is attracted by Christianity. And you see, we've forgotten that. The rabbi of Rome converted to Christianity. We have forgotten that many, many Jews during the war who were saved by Christians, and some who converted really because of the need to convert to something else. So Melech Davidson is very tempted by Christianity. He comes under the tutelage of a Monsignor, and this Monsignor sends him to the Sistine Chapel and thinks that if anyone sees Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, well,
he'll see the truth.
That will nail it. No, but that's going to be the combination of what Christianity was able to do artistically and what Christianity resembles. And so he stands there, and the gloss that you talked about, the gloss that he writes, right, about that, is considered one of the best chapters of art criticism. I mean, that's what it's been called, because what Melech Davidson does there is he really, really looks at the Sistine Chapel, and he really tries to understand all the panels of the story that Michelangelo is telling with this. So you see what I mean here? You see the real temptation. That's another step of this progress that is very interesting, because the messianic quest for the Messiah, of course, it went through Christianity. You see, that is part of the story. People thought that Christ was the Messiah, right? So that becomes part of the story too. And Klein dares to say, to take the part of Christianity that is most persuasive, perhaps, if you listen to the St. Matthew Passion and you listen to Bach's uh, uh, Passions, and you hear his cantatas. Um, if there's
Can you
ever
stand under the Sistine Chapel?
And you stand under the Sistine Chapel, if there's ever a moment when you think, "Oh my God, this is might," uh, that's it. I mean, you see, Jews have been persuaded by that, and so he wants us, you see, to understand.
Yeah.
Mess-
There's a line in the book where he talks about what it would mean to pass under the Arch of Titus, and
Yes, yes. What would it mean under the Arch of Titus? So you have these two very important moments where we take the messianic quest very seriously. He doesn't just really run for it at the end. It is Jews really sought the Messiah in many, many forms, and he wants to really record the way in which one went from one to the other. Of course, the chapter then in Casablanca is very different because by that time, Melech has said that he's not going to be a Christian. He's turned his back. He said to the Monsignor, "Thanks, but really no thanks." But there's a wonderful little joke there. Um, Klein, the Klein narrator, goes to the JDC, to the Joint Distribution Committee. How is he going? Which Melech Davidson was working for at that point, and he wants to find his uncle. He's always looking for his uncle. And the man at the JDC, who was actually a good friend of Melech Davidson's, says to him, "No, no, he's very restless. He doesn't stop anywhere, but he feels at this point that he has to go to see his brethren in the East." And so he's gone off to Casablanca, and the man says, "I do hope he has not gotten hold of the Koran." And,
because he'll be tempted by that as well.
Exactly. And the Klein and so the Klein narrator says, "I was grateful for his little joke." Right. So we have it there, right? That this character is so acceptable that
right. To me, and tell me if you think I'm misreading it. In other words, there's this kind of image of like it's a Christian image, of course, which we've transformed and adopted in ambivalent ways of this. They're wandering Jews. Klein and Davidson are both these kinds of wander. First of all, they're literally wandering. They're on this voyage, and the Jew in exile and the Jew for all of the years of Galut is desperate for an answer, for hope, for a vision of something that will change and improve, and is disappointed and disillusioned and tragically, suffers, the traumas of pogroms and Shoah, along the way, until the arrival in the newly revived state, at which point the Messiah character leaves the stage. I mean, tragically leaves the stage.
well,
As if to say, well, now with the return to Jewish life and Jewish creativity and Jewish homeland and Jewish language, we've found an anchor from which we can stop our wandering, but also in some ways stop our searching for solutions.
Well, yes, it can be read that way, and of course, as you say, he is he goes up in fire at the end. He is martyred at the
Yeah,
end,
and then he's
and anointed at the end. But
well, he's anointed in the sense that he has petrol put over him and he's lit a
yes,
fire.
that he set afire by the enemy. But let's back up just a little bit because we haven't gotten quite. I don't want to leave out the Casablanca part at all, which is very important here, as you say, not just the wandering Jews, but he has to do the ingathering of the exiles. I mean, what he is doing here, if this is an exodus that brings us back to the land of Israel, then he has to go all the way. And that's why he stops at Casablanca, because he doesn't want this to be just a European journey. He's got to bring in the Jews who are coming from Middle East as well. So that chapter is very rich. How does he make that rich? It's quite interesting. He goes into the Mela. So at first, he gives you the smells of the East, the tastes of the East. and the way in which he feels at home with the music of the East. And he recognizes words that Arabic and Hebrew merge. So there's that sense of at homeness in a sense, but at the same time, he sees the ghetto. This is the first ghetto that he's actually been in, where there's tremendous filth. And what Melech Davidson then does is he defies the JDC, he defies this organization. And what he says he's going to do is he leads these beggars out of the Mellah, out of the ghetto. And he really causes a riot in Casablanca. So Melech Davidson, at that point, the messianic figure, really sort of becomes an activist in the Casablanca context, in the Middle Eastern context, and leads them to the land of Israel. But I would just draw your attention to one thing. You see, the actual book of Deuteronomy ends with the death of Moses. So the messianic figure in that sense would have had to not get to the land of Israel. So Melech Davidson, yes, suggests the messianic figure, but in that chapter of Casablanca, he also suggests the Moses figure.
Moses figure.
Yes, because you also have something which is leading the Jews back to the land of Israel. Actually, that's the story as well. So when he gets to Israel, to Israel as it has just been founded, but is still very much at war, still a very dangerous place, actually, still a very poor country. It's very much the Babel. It is very much still the rabble of a country that hasn't yet really settled into its own permanent identity. And then we should talk about the culmination of that other part of the plot. What happens to the book? What happens to the anthology of poetry that he is supposed to be collecting? And what happens to finding the Messiah? What happens to, not that, I won't say that. What happens to finding the elusive? So those two things have to be resolved by the end.
I thought we might take a look at one, or we probably only have time at this point for only one passage. Do you recommend we look at the beginning of Exodus or the section from Deuteronomy that you had chosen for us?
Well, the passage from Exodus is my absolute favorite.
Oh, then we must. So here it is. Would you like to read it out loud, or shall I?
Well, it's not that one. No, it's not. But you know what, Jeffrey, if you don't mind, I think that it would be better perhaps to do the other, because we're at the back of the book at this point. So,
yeah, so here's the Deuteronomy section. He's describing these. Yes. He's describing the this is page 107 in my edition. I have the old I have the old Knopf edition.
Many editions.
But somebody actually asks, in the book is available in these multiple editions. You can buy it used or these new reprints on Amazon. It's certainly available. I don't believe that it's available in Hebrew translation.
Wait a minute. No. This is such an interesting little. I don't want to stop you because I know we're running out of time here. But you see, this is a book that how can it be translated into Hebrew if, in a sense, what Klein has tried to do is to write a Hebrew English? The whole book is you see what I mean? This is so fascinating, since he has actually created here the closest thing to a Hebraic English that is at all possible. Who is going to be the genius of Hebrew who is going to
reverse translating
translating? And so I leave it to somebody here. But this comes actually, this passage that we both chose here, this comes after and during the fact that he is looking for the poets. So he does translate Rachel. He finds Natan Alterman.
Rachel HaMishoreret, Natan Alterman.
Right, and he finds Uri Tzvi Greenberg, and he has a little bit to say about them. But after that, he says, well, wait a minute.
And I presume that is autobiographical. He did encounter those poets or their writing.
Of
certainly.
course. Well, he had translated those poets.
Yeah, yeah.
He
No,
did,
but
yeah.
he actually did. He encountered. He meets with Alterman and with Ritzvik
He
Greenberg and with
meets with them,
yeah.
yes. And I by the way, that's to my mind the weakest part of the book. He does not do credit to these poets. Because he's trying to get to his solution here. I think that he kind of does not do justice, certainly not to Alterman, certainly not. Anyway, but what he does say then is they were not members of literary societies, the men who were giving new life to the antique speech, but merchants, tradesmen, day laborers. In their daily activity and without pose or flourish, they showed it to be alive again, the shaping Hebrew imagination. An insurance company, I observed as I lingered in Tel Aviv's commercial center, called itself Sneh, after Moses' burning bush, which had burned and burned but had not been consumed. Inspired metaphor, born not of the honored laureate, but of some actuary, a man of prose. A well known brand of Israeli sausage was being advertised, it gladdened my heart to see, as Bashan, just tribute to its magnum size, royal compliment descended from Og, Bashan's giant king. A dry cleaner called his firm Keshet, the rainbow, symbol of cessation of floods. An ice cream organization, Kortov, punned its way to custom fissioning Kortov, a drop, to Kortov, cold and good. You see? And then he says, in my student days, I had been fascinated always by that word which put an end to the irreconcilable controversies of the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. This house would maintain permitted, this house would insist prohibited. A deadlock would ensue. Came then the Talmud editor and wrote, Teku, stet, the question abides. My teacher would then go on to explain that Teku was really a series of initials that stood for Tishbi, Yitaretz, Koshiot, Va'abayot. The Tishbite would resolve all problems and difficulties. Now the magic cataleptic word was there before me again, a new context in the newspaper, a report of a football game where the score had been tied. Teku. You see, so, but 50, you see that same cadence is in the speech. You see how majestic he wants the endings of these things to be, and how miraculous he finds this. And then, by the way, he says that these.
I mean, as miraculous as the idea that there's a Natan Alterman or Rachela Mishorer, there are people, or Bialik, who he translates, people that have revived the ancient language. Of course, he doesn't know of Agnon at this point, but people who've revived the
Yes.
ancient language and made it anew again. Have taken the molds of the classics and poured new life into them. But he's as enchanted with with the ad men, who are coming up with clever terms, and this idea that somehow this new Jewish creativity, as expressed specifically through not just literature but language, of the everyday Jewish life, this is the sign of the miracle.
This is absolutely. And then he does say about it, it was as if I was a spectator to the healing of torn flesh, or heard a broken bone come together, set, and grow again. You see that this is like from Ezekiel. You see, this is the broken bones, and he is hearing the broken words coming together and healing again. Um, exactly. He is so intent on our use, and he uses language. This is a poet's ability. He uses language. The book is actually very much about language itself.
Right. You drew my attention to the fact that he was a profound influence on that other great Montrealer Jewish wordsmith, your friend, the musician Leonard
Yes.
Cohen. So we have only a few minutes left because we do want to end in time for those of us in Israel to
Please.
participate in the observances of Yom HaShoah. But I'd like you just in a few minutes, and again, this is hopefully we've tempted people to go out. You corrected me that Klein was never forgotten, but in fact, I admit my own ignorance until
Oh no,
you
of
you
course, of
educated me,
course.
until you schooled me. He was unknown to me, and I assume unknown to many. Um, And so we do hope people will now read him and discuss. So I want to ask you two things. One is, about, well, this influence on Cohen and the your own personal encounter with him. But then maybe we should just close off with, a reflection on, okay, we go back to this classic work from 70 plus years ago. And of course, we discover that in the particular moment we find ourselves in, which is a very complicated, tragic, traumatic moment for Jewish life here in the land of Israel, for Jewish life there in North America, and particularly on university campuses where you spent so much of your career. What is Klein telling us? How does he resonate with this particular moment? So I leave the time to your discretion to use as you think best
Thank
to
you so
answer these
much.
questions.
Well, let me not, I mean, I don't want to neglect saying more than anything. Thank you so much.
No,
And for all you do, because, your Beit Agnon is is a model to us of how culture should live. That
thank you.
and it does. I mean, everything that I see advertised as I wish I were there, that I could come
Mhm.
to
We
hear.
wish you were here too.
Yeah, well, thank you. No, there isn't a single thing that you say that, or a single person invited to read or whatever, that I wouldn't like to be there for. So really, and thank you for the chance of really introducing Klein. And obviously, he's not known very much beyond the Canadian public. But here's about this moment. You see why this is so important to me, is because we are very good at marking the Shoah. We are very good at mourning. We are the best people in the world at mourning. The 3 weeks of the summertime. Uh, we mourn, we mourn. There are small mournings and large mournings and personal mournings and all the rest of it. We are very bad at celebrating the miracle of the land of Israel. And what our enemies are trying to do is to dirty it, to make it defensive, to smear it, to take all our joys and to turn them into days of mourning. That's why they attack on holidays. That's why they attack on the Sabbath and on holidays. They are trying beyond anything else to make sure that we are not a joyous people, that we do not bring Israel out into the world to say what a miracle this is of our creation. And that's why this book is so important, because Klein felt it, lived it, and wrote it. And there are people for whom this book won't work because it is so rich. You know, they're not used to prose of this kind. They're not used to that, and they're not used to that tone of heightening everything, of raising it to its highest possibility. So it's that I think that I would like to emphasize about this more than anything. Not to be afraid of that part of it, not to be afraid of saying how great something is. Now, the ending of this, as you say, the ending of the book, well, Melech Davidson is killed the way many Jews in the fulfillment of the land of Israel were killed, right? They were not all set in fire, but now, isn't that unbelievable?
Yeah.
Indeed, this is exactly what they did with so many of the bodies. Um, so that's the painful part of this. You see that part of that messianic hope was not just a hope for the redemption of the Jewish people and returning to the land of Israel, but it was a hope for mankind, for humankind, right? And so in a way that is appropriate, that Melech Davidson um, should both come to the land of Israel and be a teacher there and heralded there, but yes, be martyred as well, because part of the recovery has that part of it in it.
Um, uh, we only have a few minutes left. I would like you to tell the story, which is recounted. I should mention your recent memoir, "Free as a Jew."
Right.
It
Thank
recounts
you.
the story of how you came to be the shadchanit between Avram Sutzkever, the great Yiddish poet, and meeting Klein. Now, Klein, unfortunately had a kind of tragic end. He was ill, mental illness, physical illness for many years. At the end of his life, he becomes something of a recluse, was
Right.
not accepting people, and somehow you were involved in putting this meeting together. So we can't end this conversation without you telling that one
Okay,
story.
well, I will. As a matter of fact, David Kaufman is a very talented Canadian filmmaker who, by the way, made a film about Klein, which he's just refurbished. So
Oh,
that will be available, and you might want to show it at Beit
mm-hmm.
Avichai. And I tell the
Beit
story.
Agnon, Beit Agnon.
Sorry, in Beit Agnon. Please forgive me, but we could do Beit Avichai too,
Yes.
but this is Beit Agnon, yes. But I tell the story in the movie as
Ah,
well. So yes, well, Avram Sutzkever had come for a speaking tour to Montreal, and he wanted more than anything to meet A.M. Klein. And I knew that A.M. Klein had fallen into a terrible depression, was not seeing anyone. But I called Klein, and he very graciously
and you
said,
had never met him before that.
no, I had not met him before,
Yeah.
and because of this same reason that he was, but Sutzkever wanted it so badly that I did, and then of course Klein said yes, and we went there. It was wonderful meeting between the two of them. They spoke about poets that they liked together, that they all kinds of things. Well, and was just before we left, Klein said, "Would you like to see my office?" And so he took both of us into his office, and there we were in his office. And then we left. And when we left, Sutzkever stopped at the first corner, and he was so depressed. He stopped like this, and he was in a state of dikaon. And I said, "What happened?" Because to me, this had been unbelievable,
Mm-hmm.
glorious.
Sure.
And he said, "Did you see his desk?" I said, "His desk?" He said, "Did you see Klein's desk? There was nothing in it, nothing on it, not a piece of paper, not a pencil." He said, "When that happens, the man is finished as a writer."
He'd hung up his pen.
Yes, and of course he was finished as a writer, but that was what impressed itself. So it was like, it was, you know, I had not, I had not registered that, let me say, and so it was both illuminating from.
What year was that?
That was 1959.
Hmm. Long time ago.
1959. Yes.
Well, Ruth, thank you for your insights as always. We always look forward to. We're happy to do this more than once a year, but we're always
Thank you.
grateful for our yearly
Thank you.
gathering here in Beit Agnon. We hope to host you
Thanks,
on your next
Jeffrey.
visit to Jerusalem in
Thank you.
Beit Agnon. And thank you for bringing these treasures to our attention and reminding us of
Very
how
kind.
very relevant they are. Um, the
Indeed.
links to some of the things we spoke about are available in the chat. You can download these samples of the texts. We didn't get to most of them, but of course you can find A.M. Klein's The Second Scroll and read it and make your own investigation into how it speaks to our lives here as Jews in the state of Israel, in North America, or wherever it is that you may be. Thank you for joining us. Please sign up to get information from Beit Agnon so that you'll hear about all of our programming. And there's one spot left for the lucky individual or couple that would like to travel with us to Poland this summer. So, Professor Ruth Weiss, my teacher, my friend, thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much, Jeffrey. Thank you.